Okay, so tonight we're gonna begin. We left off in the midst of chapter 8, and we've been seeing several healing miracles within this chapter. So remember, Matthew alternates in his gospel between narratives, and he tells us about the things that Jesus did, and then he'll have a block of teaching. And so those discourses of teaching, we saw that really long discourse on the Sermon on the Mount, and he has 5 of these that alternate back and forth. Matthew 8 to 10 is one of these narrative sections that tells us more of the actions that Jesus did, and especially what we're seeing is Jesus's power, his power over demons, his power over sickness, his deliverance from suffering within this unit. And we saw 3 kind of healing so far, and even within this section in Matthew 8 to 10, we'll have 3 healings, and then Jesus will say a couple things, and then we'll have 3 more healings, and this happens 3 different times that we have these 3 healings together. So the 3 we've seen so far, Jesus cleanses the leper. And we talked about how he healed that leper by touching him and making that leper clean. Jesus healed the centurion's son or servant, and he did that by the power of his word, and recognized the faith of the centurion, who would have likely been a Gentile and as a Roman soldier. And then Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law and others that came as a result of the word that had spread about his healing power. So that brings us up then to chapter 8, verse 18, and we have here an interaction between Jesus and a scribe and a disciple. So let's read this together, 18 through 22. Someone could read that for us.
I will, since I have sound.
Since you have sound, I'm glad you have sound, Martha.
Now, when Jesus saw great multitudes about him, he gave a command to depart to the other side. Then a certain scribe came and said to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Then another of his disciples said to him, "Lord, let me first go and bury my father." But Jesus said to him, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead."
Thank you. So here we have kind of 2 sayings that Jesus shares on discipleship in response to these 2 different individuals. First of all, Jesus kind of dismisses the crowd, and he gives orders to leave for the other side. And then we have an unusual character to come and ask Jesus that he wants to be a follower. Who is this first character there in verse 19?
A scribe.
A scribe.
A scribe. This is kind of surprising, isn't it? Because normally when we have seen scribes in Matthew's gospel, and particularly in Luke's gospel, when we saw scribes, they were always usually mentioned in negative context. But here is a scribe who actually professes a desire to follow Jesus, and he calls and recognizes Jesus to be a teacher, and he says, "Jesus, I will follow you wherever you go." The scribe, he doesn't set any conditions on his discipleship, but he offers to follow Jesus, and Jesus, though, takes this as an opportunity to say something. And what does Jesus say in response to this? "I will follow you wherever you go"?
Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests.
Mm-hmm. So that he talks about all the animals that have these places to stay, but then when it comes to the Son of Man, doesn't have anywhere to lay his head. What do you think about that? What point do you think Jesus is making?
You may not know what you're committing to.
Yeah, you might not know what you're signing up for when you want to follow me, right? And the implication is, if you're going to follow me, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be hard. The point is to contrast, I think, the birds that have nests and the animals, the foxes that have dens. But Jesus saying that the Son of Man doesn't have a place to lay his head, I think is saying the same thing, that those who follow Jesus, it might come to the point that you don't even have a place of refuge. So following him isn't going to be an easy path. It's similar in some ways to what he was talking about when he was preaching in the Sermon on the Mount, and the narrow way and the road that is hard, as opposed to the wide gate, or the way that is easy. So this is him saying that following him is not necessarily going to be a piece of cake. And the thing that's interesting about it is, how does the scribe respond?
It doesn't say.
He doesn't say, right? It's open-ended. We don't know how that scribe responded to Jesus. We don't know whether he said, okay, I'm going to follow you anyway, or whether he said, well, that sounds difficult, I'm not going to follow you. We don't know exactly what the scribe did. So I think that challenge is recorded not necessarily for that scribe. That challenge is recorded for us as readers of the gospel, to ask ourselves, how are we going to respond to Jesus's statement? And how are we going to respond to the call to follow him, even when that call is challenging and when that call is difficult? And so I think that leaving that open-ended really is a way that allows us to enter into the story and ask ourselves, how would we respond to that? Well, then we have a second interaction. And this one here, I think it's interesting in verse 21, because it says another of his disciples, which to me indicates that maybe that scribe was a disciple, because when it says another disciple, maybe the scribe was someone who had followed Jesus. But here we have another disciple, and he asks for permission. What does he ask for permission?
Wants to go bury his
Bury his
father.
father.
Yeah, it seems innocent enough. Let me go back and bury my father. This would remind us of an Old Testament story, and that would be the story of Elijah and Elisha. If you might recall in 1 Kings chapter 19, when Elijah comes and calls Elisha to kind of be his protege, Elijah says, okay, well, let me go back and greet and kiss my mother and my father, and then I'll follow you. And in that case, Elijah says, okay. I don't know whether Elijah was happy about it, but he allowed it to happen. And Elisha was able to do that. But here, Jesus does not seem to say, yeah, go ahead and do that. And it seems a little bit odd and callous of Jesus, don't you think? Because here's a person who is concerned to take care of their father. And burying the dead in that culture was considered a sacred duty. You can read about that in many places within the Jewish literature, and even was seen as a fulfillment of the fifth commandment, which was to honor one's mother and father in Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy 5. So it seems like a reasonable request, but what does Jesus, how does he respond?
Let the dead bury their own dead.
Yeah, he starts with these words, follow me, and the dead will bury their own dead. So what do you think he means by that? First of all, let the dead bury their own dead.
I assume that it means that the first dead are the people who do not know Christ or
Mhm.
haven't received him. And then the second one would be someone who's literally dead.
That's kind of the way I read it as well, and I think that would be the way to see it. Is the one is kind of a figurative use of dead, meaning dead in their sins, or dead in their faith, and not within Christ. And so they would be spiritually dead, and then the others would be the actual physically dead. So in a sense, Jesus says, let the spiritually dead bury the physical dead. And I think that is kind of the sense. So this being so different than Elijah allowing Elisha to do that, being very different than the command to honor your parents. I really think this is Jesus emphasizing the urgency of following him, that following him is more important than even some of the most sacred duties that you have, that this is of such urgency that even something that that is a duty that normally would be something that you really should take the time to deal with, you have to even forsake all that for the sake of the kingdom, because this is a very urgent thing, following him. And I think that is kind of the idea, that this call to discipleship is seen as an urgent announcement. And because the kingdom is coming, the kingdom is near, following Jesus must supersede even your responsibilities that you would normally have to your family. So I think that really changes how that duty is seen in that reference.
I'm still pondering this because, first of all, in the Jewish culture, if you had someone who died, you took care of burial almost immediately.
Mhm.
There was no
Yeah.
time for, I mean, they wait at the most, they waited 3 days, because after 4 days the spirit left, or whatever they were thinking.
For sure. Yeah.
And so that's one. And the other thing is, if his father is dead, then why is he with Jesus instead of being with him, burying him, or doing whatever needs to be done there? So I'm wondering if he wants to follow Jesus, but he has responsibilities at home that are going to involve more time, and definitely a lack of commitment. And Jesus is addressing that, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, and that idea, it's like that kind of idea. Did he suddenly receive word that his father had died and he's been out there with Jesus, and then it's this like, I got to go back and take care of this, and Jesus is like, well, follow me and let that take care of itself? Or the question of, why isn't he where he should be in this case does come up as well. And we don't know really any of that background, because we only have these two verses that tell us what that is. But it seems to be that whatever the situation, that there is some sort of half-heartedness that Jesus picks up in this disciple, I think.
This is Tom. Can I ask a question or another?
Yes,
this
Tom,
particular
this
issue?
way Martha will really know that you're here.
Okay, but I'll have to look at her upside down like I usually
All
do.
right.
There we go. I have always, in this particular passage, it has been the situation of, well, I can't leave away because my father hasn't died yet, and I want to stay here as long as I've sort of committed that I'll hang around until he's dead, so I can bury him. So in other words, there may not be a death now, but it's
and that would be possible. Yeah, we don't even know. Is he saying, let me wait until my father dies, and I gotta take care of that responsibility first? That's a possible way.
Just another way. It's all good.
Yeah, it doesn't really say for sure. It doesn't say, hey, dad died, I need to go back and bury him. It just says, let me go back and bury my father. So is that like he's waiting around for that to happen and then he'll follow Jesus? That might be the kind of situation too. So that would be a possible way to read that. And that's what I love about some of these stories.
Abraham also stay in Tehran till his father died before he moved on to the land of Canaan?
Yeah, so you have some Old Testament instances where this was some of the practice, and maybe it's just, I wonder if it's Jesus really kind of saying, commitment to his kingdom and the kingdom that Jesus has brought is so important that even what they had to do in the Old Testament isn't the way now, because this is the most urgent thing. The most urgent thing is following me, and every other responsibility pales in comparison to that. But the other thing that I wonder in this passage is, and it's Mark's gospel has it differently, in that Jesus has already said in Mark's gospel, the whole thing about his family, and he redefines who his family is, that the family are those who do the will of God. And when he says, who are my mothers, my brother, who is my mother and my brothers? So in Mark's gospel, he kind of has set that the family has a redefinition. It's about those who are doing the will of God, and that our responsibility is now to that spiritual family, in a sense, as opposed to our physical family, and which in some cases, even in Jesus's own experience, says, you're crazy, and just kind of disassociates with the followers of Christ. So that could be something in the background, as well as that understanding of the redefinition of family that comes into play. But definitely one of those where several ways you can kind of read that, and we don't have a whole lot of to say on it because there's only those 2 verses, so you kind of have to pick what it is there. But I think it's definitely kind of Jesus really emphasizing the urgency of the kingdom and the call to discipleship. Good thoughts. Any other questions on that?
It could mean like also like your uncle, your uncle.
Yeah,
And
any family member, I think, would be implied in that. So that following Jesus is that important. All right. Well, let's look at the next narrative here, which is 23 to 27. And this is a familiar story, the stealing of the storm. So if someone could read those verses 23 to 27.
I will.
Thank you, Betty.
Then he got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Suddenly, a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." He replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him."
Thank you, Betty. Appreciate that. So it's kind of established this theme of discipleship with the past 2 sayings there in the previous verses, and now Matthew narrates the crossing of the sea. And what is important, I think, to Matthew is that even right in from the very beginning, he paints the disciples very differently than Mark does, because he is very clear that there in verse 23, what are the disciples doing?
they're crossing what I call ocean, but it's not really ocean, the sea,
They're crossing the sea. And why are they doing that?
to get to the other side.
That's right, but that is the right answer.
They're following Jesus.
Yeah, that's it. Right there in verse 23, when he got in the boat, the disciples followed him. That's what disciples are supposed to do. And so I want you to see that in this story, the disciples are doing the thing that they are supposed to do. They are following Jesus, which is a term that connotes discipleship. And so it's this idea that the disciples are already following Jesus. And in Matthew, then the boat is overtaken by a great storm. Interesting, in light of this morning's sermon, the word there is seismos, which sounds a lot like seismic activity, which connotes an earthquake. And so that's the word there is earthquake. And so the boat is at sea. It's in this great storm, and things are shaking. And what's Jesus doing?
Sleeping.
Sleeping.
Yeah.
Amen.
So, and it emphasizes it that the boat was being swamped by the waves, but Jesus, he himself, it emphasizes he himself was sleeping, and he continued to sleep even through all that. Sleeping in a boat might remind us of another Old Testament story where someone slept, and that was Jonah. That story ended up a little differently, but it does remind us somewhat of that, the sea and the boat and all that. So the disciples, it's interesting. In Mark, they kind of rebuke Jesus and they say, teacher, don't you care that we're dying? That's what they say in Mark's gospel. But here it seems to be more of a prayer that is directed in a right way, because what do they call Jesus?
Lord,
Lord. So right away, that recognition of Jesus's lordship, they recognize who he is, and then they request from him salvation. Save us, because we are perishing, we're about to die. So they're recognizing Jesus's ability to do something about their situation. And so that's what happens. So then Jesus turns to the disciples, and so he doesn't deal right with the storm right away. What's he deal with first?
The disciples.
Yeah. And what does he say to the disciples?
Little
why are
faith.
you
Have
afraid?
little faith.
Yeah. Why are you afraid? You of little faith.
Little faith.
The indication is that the problem isn't the storm. The problem is their lack of faith. So their little faith somehow. And it seems to be that it's not that they totally lack faith. Note that they do have some measure of faith, but it's not the level that it needs to be that allows them to really rely on that faith in the midst of this storm. So they have faith, but it's not the faith that allows them to persevere.
Matthew.
Yeah.
It says up here, the storm, it calls it a tempest.
The tempest, yeah.
Yeah.
That gives you kind of that idea of more
yeah,
than
that's
just
what they call the storm. That's what they call the storm in my Bible.
Mm-hmm. It's neat to see the different ways they translate.
So that of little faith right there comes out. The
Mhm.
storm was tempting them.
Yeah, you can see that connection between there.
They had faith that he could save them.
They did,
just
right?
that he wasn't doing it. He needed to do it.
Yeah. So that's right. I think that's important to recognize in this story, that they have a measure of faith. They recognize who Jesus is. They recognize that he has the ability to save them. But for whatever reason, it doesn't allow them to overcome their fear in the midst of the storm. And that's the issue here. And so then immediately after he says that, first note that verb in verse 26. Then what does it say?
He arose.
He arose. That sounds familiar. Next Sunday we'll be singing that song. But
Yes.
that is actually the same verb for resurrected, interestingly enough. I don't know if there's any real significance to that, but I think it's interesting that here maybe is this idea that the resurrection even is being foreshadowed in what Jesus does. But he gets up and immediately then he rebukes the wind and waves. He does what only God could do in the Old Testament scriptures. You can read about that. Psalm 107 is a huge one that talks about how the wonderful deeds of the Lord and how he works in the midst of the deep, how he raised and commanded the stormy wind and lifted up the waves of the sea. It says in that psalm, they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. And then they were glad because they had quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love and for his wonderful works to the children of men. So that is, I think, a fulfillment of Psalm 107. And it says immediately, I love this, immediately there was a great calm, which is a reversal of the beginning of the story. And the verb there in verse 24, if you have the literal translations, it will say great storm. So the great storm gives way to a great calm. And so that's what we have, this great reversal that takes place. And then the disciples, they kind of confirm the miracle with their response. They were amazed and they asked, what sort of man is this? And the winds and the waves obey him. So I think this is kind of a reminder. I like to think about this, Matthew is writing after the death and resurrection of Jesus, and he's writing at a time when the early church was just growing and starting to spread, and they probably felt a lot like a battered ship at sea. And sometimes maybe we feel that way as well, but they probably felt that they were in that period of adversity, and that they were sometimes in a great storm or a great tempest. And in the midst of that, this story would remind them that the power of the Lord is greater than any storm and greater than any adversary. I think this is an echo that Jesus is Emmanuel, that he is God with us, and even in the midst of the storm. I think about a passage like Isaiah 43, that when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. This is God being present with them, and God demonstrating his power on their behalf. And so I think this would be an encouraging passage to the burgeoning church, and it's encouragement to us as well. Any thoughts or other observations in that story? All right. Let's look at our next story, which is in verses. So we're going to start in verse 28 and go to the first verse of chapter 9. So we'll stop at 9 verse 1. So 8:28 to 9 verse 1. Could somebody read that section for us?
I can.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
When he had come to the other side, to the country of the Gerasenes, there met him 2 demon-possessed men coming out of the tombs, exceedingly fierce, so that no one could pass that way. And suddenly they cried out, saying, "What are we to do with you, Jesus, you Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" Now a good way off from them there was a herd of many swine feeding. So the demons begged him, saying, If you cast us out, permit us to go away into the herd of swine. And he said to them, "Go." So when they had come out, they went into the herd of swine, and suddenly the whole herd of the swine ran violently down the steep place into the sea and perished in the water. Then those who kept them fled, and they went away into the city and told everything, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men. And behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus. And when they saw him, they begged him to depart from their region.
And then if you just don't mind the first
Oh,
verse.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
So he got into a boat, crossed over, and came to his own city.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So here we kind of have in the middle story of this whole section of chapter 8 through 10. We have this story that is the middle story, and Jesus meets the power of evil kind of directly through the demonic in this part. So the story takes place in the town or the city of, it's translated probably different ways in the region there in verse 28. Sometimes it'll say Gerasenes, sometimes it says Gadarenes. And so you'll see a lot of different kind of ways that is worded. But everyone is in agreement that it was a region in the Decapolis, which was this federation of Gentile cities that was east of the Jordan River. And so here we have another story, just as we had with the Romans, the centurion earlier, that kind of points us to Jesus's Gentile mission and outreach beyond the borders of Israel. And so Jesus, it's clear Jesus goes and they are on the other side of the sea. They're in this region that is in Gentile territory, and all of a sudden Jesus is met by 2 men. So they're 2 kind of fierce demoniacs. They come out of the tomb, and they are it says so violent that they prevent anyone from passing that way. And the details really underscore how wild these demon-possessed men were, and kind of their state of cleanness, and because they live among the tombs, and that would automatically make them unclean in the Jewish idea. And so the demon possessed man, but they come and they greet Jesus, though, don't they? So with what words do they greet him?
They recognize who he is, Son of
That's the
God.
first thing, right? Yeah.
God.
Recognize Son of God. I think that's really significant. That's these demon possessed men. They recognize Jesus and who he is. The next part is then they ask Jesus a question.
Have you come here to torment us?
Yeah. So what the kind of a double question and the same idea in both questions is, what do you have to do with us? And then they anticipate the worst, that, yeah, have you come here to torment us? And so they know who Jesus is. They address him with that title, Son of God, which recognizes that that's who we know Jesus is from the very beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, that he is indeed the Son of God. And have you come to torment us before the time? What time do you think it is that they're referencing when they say before the time?
The end.
The end. Yeah, I think that is what they're talking about. Kind of the end times, at the end when God will fully defeat and overthrow evil in the kingdom of Satan. I think this is kind of looking forward to the end times, if you will. And so I think that's the final judgment. And so they say, are you here to torment us before that end time? And then Matthew draws our attention. He says that there was kind of not far from them a large herd of pigs that was feeding. And so if you're thinking this story the way Matthew tells it, all of a sudden your attention is diverted over to the mountainside or somewhere where these pigs are, and we begin to see these pigs, and they anticipate that they are going to be cast out of the two men. And so they kind of ask Jesus, even before he tries to drive them out, or there's any kind of words that Jesus speaks, they make the request, if you cast us out, send us into the herd of pigs. And so note that this story is really another boundary crossing story. Jesus has crossed to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. He encounters the demon-possessed men who are unclean because they are living among the tombs, and they're close to swine. And that swine would be another clear indication of Gentile uncleanness, because this was not something that Jews would associate with these pigs. And so then Jesus speaks, and what does he say?
Go.
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 So,
Yeah, you notice that? One word that Jesus says, and with one word, Jesus banishes the demons. I think that's very powerful. Go. And they do it. Jesus banishes them. So they had asked to be sent into the pigs, and Jesus says, go, and they go. That's the same word, by the way, that with which Jesus dismissed Satan back in chapter 4, verse 10. And so go. I think they go. So the entire herd then, it says, charged back down this bank into the sea and drowned into the water. Now, Mark has a story that is very similar to this one. And that's the story in which they have the man who has possessed with demon, and they ask the name, and the demons say Legion. And so in that case, a legion was a Roman military group of like 5,000 or something. So could have been a large group of swine, but they rush down the bank and they're drowned. Also, the going down into the water and drowning is a reminder of another event in the Old Testament, and that would be the Exodus, where those who are pursuing the Israelites are are drowned while they're crossing over to the other side of the sea. And so I think part of that story here is that what Jesus is kind of indicating, what Matthew is indicating, the way he presents this story, is that evil is destructive, but it's also self-destructive. That it goes and it actually self-destructs. And so that's what's happening as these demons go down into the watery chaos, and they perish with the pigs. Matthew then in verse 33 draws our attention to some people that had witnessed this, and the witnesses are the swineherds. So they become witnesses. They go into the city and they do what witnesses do. They report everything and told what had happened to the demon-possessed men. And then it says in verse 34, because of their witness, what happens?
The whole city came out to meet Jesus.
Yeah, the whole city. So it's everyone came out to meet Jesus. And this time, though, everyone does what action when they speak to Jesus?
Begs him to leave.
Yeah. So it's not, hey, let's come out and see this guy. And like other stories where people bring, people to be delivered from demon possession and to be healed from their illnesses because of Jesus's power. But instead, what they do is they beg Jesus to leave. And that's what they do. And Jesus, I think someone said something like, Jesus is always a gentleman or something, but this is the thing, is Jesus doesn't force himself where he's not welcome. And as soon as they beg him to leave, he doesn't just stick around. He gets into the boat and crosses to the other side and came back to his own city. And I think that's amazing, is here's Jesus who has the power to banish demons with one word, and he accedes to the townspeople and their wish that he would leave the area, and he crosses back to the other side. This is clearly a story that demonstrates, on one hand, Jesus's power and his ability to deliver humanity from all the dehumanizing powers of evil. And on the other hand, it's a story that illustrates that, Jesus is there for us if we will allow him room to work, but that if we choose not to allow him that space, that he won't force himself upon us. And so he leaves and goes to the other side. Any observations on this healing story?
The witnesses were more concerned that he just destroyed their income source.
Yeah, likely that
He
would
got
be
rid
part
of
of
their
that, right?
swine. They were more interested in that than they were in meeting Jesus.
Yep, they're more interested in what they've lost than what Jesus said. And in the idea that Jesus just delivered these two guys, that's not what's important to them. It's what they've lost, and the upheaval that Jesus brings. And Jesus makes things uncomfortable, and they obviously are not concerned with Jesus's healing. They're more concerned with what they had to give up in order for that to happen.
I also found it interesting that they begged him to leave.
Mm.
And I think about other times when he basically had stirred things up and they picked up stones to stone him.
Mm.
And I'm wondering whether that's Jew versus Gentile culture at that time, or they didn't have any stones, or they just, the attitude seemed very different.
Yeah,
They begged him to leave, but it wasn't really a hostile thing, or didn't seem to be. But I don't know if that's just the wording that Matthew uses.
yeah, and I'd have to look at the versions of this story elsewhere, but I do think that beg to leave does recognize that Jesus has power, right? It's different than when Jesus comes to his hometown and they try to stone him, because they basically, in that case, it's almost like, hey, you're one of us, you're a fraud kind of thing, and we're going to stone you. Whereas here, they're actually recognizing this guy has power, and he could really kind of turn things upside down here. So let's beg him to get out of the area. So it seems to be, in that sense, I think, a recognition that he is at least a very powerful miracle worker, if nothing more.
Some versions of the Bible read that 33, that the people who went to the city were afraid after they saw the demon possessed go into the pigs. So there might be an element of fear there too in their begging.
Yeah, and that's quite possible. And I think begging him to leave is the fear of, look at what this guy's already done, and is he going to cause even more damage, and what does this really mean? And I think that fear is a very real cause. And I think what's neat about this story is that Matthew doesn't tell us exactly in the way that he put it here when they begged him to leave, and so it allows us to kind of think about what reasons might we have, whether it's the loss of goods, whether it's our fear, whether it's concern that Jesus upsets the status quo. What is it that would cause us to beg Jesus to leave, and kind of fill in that gap of that story by allowing ourselves to say, how would we respond to this action? So yeah, that's certainly a very interesting story. So they've now crossed over to the other side, and we see another healing story, and that is in 2 through 8. So if someone could read this section 9, 2 through 8.
I can read it.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
And behold, they brought to him a paralytic lying on a bed. And Jesus, seeing their faith, said to the paralytic, Son, be of good cheer, your sins are forgiven you. And at once some of the scribes said within themselves, This man blasphemes. But Jesus, knowing their thoughts, said, Why do you think evil in your hearts? For which is easier to say, Your sins are forgiven you, or to say, Arise and walk? But that you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins. Then he said to the paralytic, Arise, take up your bed and go to your house. And he arose and departed to his house. Now when the multitude saw it, they marveled and glorified God who had given such power to men.
Thank you, Martha. So Jesus is now back in his hometown. It said there in verse 1 that they came back to his own city, and that was Capernaum, likely. And here the story begins with Matthew using that word behold and drawing our attention to it. And a man is brought to Jesus. It says we don't know who they are, and it's just they brought a paralyzed man to Jesus who was on a bed. And it's interesting that Mark tells us a lot of stories. He gives a lot of detail about kind of an interaction that parallels this, and he actually tells us about how they go to the roof and start bringing the paralyzed man down through the roof that way while Jesus is teaching in the house. Matthew doesn't give us as much of that detail, but it's clear that other people bring the paralyzed man to Jesus. And in verse 2, it is when Jesus sees their faith. And so I think that faith could include the paralyzed man as well as his friends, but it's the collective faith that he sees that comes. And when he sees their faith, he assures the paralytic. First of all, he says, take heart or have courage. Some translations say something like, don't be afraid. So he gives that encouragement to him. He calls the man son. And then here's a paralyzed man. And what does Jesus pronounce to him?
Your sins are forgiven.
Yeah.
Forgiven.
So here is the thing. Your sins are forgiven. We would expect him in the same way we've seen other healing stories when Peter's mother-in-law had a fever, or when a leper came to him, he dealt with the leprosy, he dealt with the fever. And here he doesn't necessarily deal with the paralysis, he deals with the sins, and he says, your sins are forgiven. Well, that is received pretty well by the scribes, right?
Sure.
So these weren't among the scribes that were saying, we want to follow you, Jesus, probably. These
No.
scribes are more antagonistic, but it doesn't say that they said it to Jesus. They were just talking amongst themselves. And the what they accused Jesus of in those conversations amongst themselves is what?
Blasphemy.
Blasphemy. And then it says, interestingly enough, Jesus, and I love the phrase here, sees their thoughts. It's almost like Jesus sees the thought bubbles above their head or something, when you have those cartoons. And Jesus is able to see their thoughts. And this points to really that, Jesus's ability to see things that that others weren't able to see. He has this ability to see into the heart. And so Jesus sees, knows their thoughts. And he says to them, he questions them, why are you thinking these evil thoughts? But when they say and accuse Jesus of blasphemy, in the New Testament times, blasphemy was seen as a way that you violated the power and the majesty of God. And what they seem to be concerned about is that Jesus is claiming for himself something that was only God's prerogative. Only God was the one who was able to forgive sins. And so by Jesus saying that he is forgiving sins and taking upon himself this action to proclaim that this man's sins are forgiven, that Jesus is taking upon himself an action that was only reserved for God. And so I think that is kind of why they see Jesus committing blasphemy. And Jesus calls that thought an evil thought, and he then challenges them with this question. And the question that he gives in verse 5 is, what is easier? And he sets two things up. Is it easier to say your sins are forgiven, or to say rise and walk? Now, what do you think's the answer to that question?
Your sons are forgiven.
So you think it's easier to say your sins are forgiven?
That would be my guess.
Yeah, it seems easier to say, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, on one level, I think you're right, Keith. Why would it be easier to say your sins are forgiven?
because to me, this is why, because he would be saying that because the reason it's hard to say, but yeah, the reason he's saying that is, in my thought, is because he is trying to be nice, but also thoughtful.
Mm-hmm. So here's part of this, right? When he says your sins are forgiven, or to rise up and walk. One of these is easy to verify, and one of them is not. It's easy to see if I say get up and walk, whether my word is right and whether that word has been confirmed, because that person will get up and walk. But if I say your sins are forgiven, there's no real physical sign that has happened. And so in some sense, it's not really clear what's the answer here. Which one is there? I think the difficulty lies in confirming whether or not the sins are forgiven. You can confirm the one very easily because you see it through physical evidence, and the other one you can't. And so I think that is part of the question. But Jesus says, and he continues the story, and he says, so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins, I'm going to do this. And so he does, the miracle follows by that healing confirms who Jesus is, and that he does indeed have the authority to forgive sins. And so that miracle of the rising up of this paralyzed man demonstrates Jesus's ability to forgive sins.
Wasn't
If I-
it common in those times for them to believe that when you had something wrong with you, it was because of the sins of your father or mother or you that had caused the whatever it was?
Yeah, and I think that might be some of what's in the background here too, right? Is this idea of back at this time, they would take something like this physical ailment and this paralysis as evidence of the man's sinfulness. And so they would see, oh, that man must have done something to cause him to have that situation. Now, Jesus really questions that kind of automatic seeing an illness and saying that that should be attributed to sin. Remember that story in John chapter 9. There's the man who is born blind, and they ask this question about the disciples are like, who sinned, this man or his parents? And Jesus, he says that's not the issue. The issue is that the glory of God can be revealed. And so he draws attention away from that question. But I think that might be behind this, and the fact that he is forgiving sins would show that Jesus has the authority to overcome even the things that are behind, perceived to be behind the illness as well. Was there something else you wanted to point out with that, Martha?
No, I
Yeah.
was just thinking that that's one thing the people would be thinking. It's the
Yeah.
sins of somebody caused this.
And so if in fact sin was the thing that was causing his paralysis, the fact that he was healed would also demonstrate that those sins were forgiven, right?
Right.
So that's the other side of this. So on both sides of this, I think it's Jesus confirming his power to forgive sins, no matter what the cause of the illness is. Jesus is able to overcome that through his forgiveness and his healing. He is able to overcome all these obstacles that stand in the way of wholeness and life. And so forgiveness and healing is all part of Jesus saying the kingdom is here, and these are the ways that Jesus is bringing new life. And so recognizing then this story is showing us that Jesus does have this authority to forgive sins. And he says to the paralyzed man, rise, take up your bed and go to your house. And the man does. He rose and went to his house. And then verse 8 is interesting. It says that Matthew says that the crowds then saw what had happened. They were filled with awe and glorified the God who gave such authority to men. It's kind of an interesting conclusion because they don't make the conclusion that I think Matthew really wants us to make. The conclusion I think Matthew wants us to make is Jesus forgives sins, and therefore Jesus is God.
Mhm.
But that's not what conclusion they make. What's the conclusion that they make?
that God had given him the power, but he still is a man,
Right.
ordinary man.
Right. They aren't recognizing that Jesus is in fact God, and that God is present among them in the person of Jesus. They're saying that Jesus has given this authority to forgive sins to human beings and to men. And so that is just a very interesting response that doesn't necessarily get, I think, to the point that Matthew wants to make, which is that Jesus is in fact God, and that is demonstrated in his authority to forgive sins. So interesting that they're getting it, and they're glorifying God, and they're recognizing that God is at work here, but they're not totally recognizing who Jesus is.
Could he kind of another thought I had is if he's asking us, which would be easier, it'd be easier for us to tell someone we forgive them,
Mhm.
because we certainly couldn't heal them physically
Right.
like he could. So he said, if you don't have the power to heal physically, you should be able to forgive each other.
Yeah, I think there
Yeah.
might be something about and there's another way to read that last statement too, about the authority, where it is the authority to men or to human beings, and that's seen as it's not just to one person, but it's a collective idea, that this could be seen as the ability that we as Christians are given the ability to forgive and to forgive each other. And that is another way to read this. And I think that is another way to read that question. I think it's really there's not a right answer to that question. I think that Jesus puts that question before them, and it's kind of like to get them thinking that both of those, depending on how you look at it, either one of those, forgiving sins or to say rise up and walk, are both difficult, but it gets us to think about exactly the kind of thing you're saying, Porter. And I think that's another way to kind of see that forgiveness is easier to extend than necessarily healing. Of course, when God's at work in us, either one of those can be true.
I see it another way too. Forgive one another as yourself.
Yeah, that's what we're called to do, is to forgive. And that's where God calls us to do. Any other observations on this? This is an interesting story.
I didn't have a chance to check it out, but my translation said that one optional translation of the word marveled, where in verse 8 is also that they were afraid. And if it were afraid, then that sort of goes back to the other group with the pigs.
Mm-hmm. That's in verse 8, that they were filled with, it could be amazement or with fear. Yeah, the word I don't have it. I don't have the Greek word in front of me either. So the translation I have says awe, but awe could also be that sense of fear. So it could go both ways with that. But yeah, that fear. It's interesting that how often that is the reaction to Jesus among the crowds and people, that he does cause fear, and that fear then causes us to miss who he is and exactly what he is doing. Any other thoughts on that section? All right. Well, next time we will pick it up in chapter 9, verse 9, with Jesus's call to Matthew, and we'll see how that story plays out as we continue through this gospel. Next, so we won't meet this Thursday because it's Maundy Thursday, so invite you to join us for Maundy Thursday if you want in person. That'll also be on Facebook, so if you want to join us on this Thursday at 7 for that, Then we'll have Good Friday at noon and Easter Sunday. So our next gathering for Bible study will be next Thursday. So we'll plan not this coming Thursday, but the Thursday after Easter. All right. Let's hit my button here.